Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on, right now, what counts as my newest worm bin, which isn't even all that new anymore at 77 days of age, 11 weeks of age. This system's got red wigglers living in it, and when I launched this system, I actually launched it with the population that lived in two separate bins. So I've been treating this as a fairly heavily populated system, and since I wanted to make sure I had ample space for these little guys to live, I started this system out by pretty much loading it all the way to the tippy top, pretty much to the capacity of the system, with bedding. And it was for that reason that we've not really added a whole lot of bedding to this system over its lifetime, because I just felt like there was really no additional room for it, not to mention the fact no need for it. But last time, oh, that's interesting, okay. Last time we did actually complement the feeding with a little bit of bedding, and that bedding really just consisted of the newspaper top covering that had been out here. So that one that I just removed was brand new last time, which was 12 days ago. And it is holding up pretty good, so I figured we would just reuse it. It was just funny because I saw this hole here with a little wormy crawling out of it, and I can reach down into this hole and I could feel that there's an empty cavity, a void that's been created down here by the worms consuming the foods that they were given last time. Interesting. So let's excavate the feeding area and see what's going on here. I knew that this was the feeding area because underneath the newspaper you saw there was a coffee filter resting here. And the coffee filters I use as feeding zone indicators to show where we last fed. Not that figuring out where you last fed should be all that difficult. You know, this system's a little bit of an oddball from the point of view of what types of foods that they've been getting. I mean, the types of foods are pretty typical. It's just your everyday kitchen scrap type feedings, like most worm farmers do. But in my wormery, I almost always freeze all the stuff that goes into my worm bins. And for a few feedings now, we've deviated from that here by not freezing any of the foods that we've been feeding with. And it sort of turned into a little bit of a trend, so I figured I would continue on with that trend. But I do believe that freezing foods aids in their breakdown and speeds that process along some. And I worried a little bit that perhaps by not having been frozen before being placed into the worm bins, that the food would not really be able to break down as readily as if it had been frozen. And like, for example, right here we're seeing an almost untouched leaf of cabbage. This is sort of one of the outer leaves of a head of cabbage, which didn't look as good as maybe what was in lower layers. So these outer layers were removed and set aside to be worm food, but never got frozen before getting fed to the worms. And I wondered, you know, after only 12 days, well, not only 12 days, because in a lot of cases 12 days is adequate time for a worm bin feeding to be depleted and require replenishment. But, you know, I'm not prepared just to find leftovers and then back away from feeding. I just have to sort of rethink, you know, what's happening here with these chunks of food that they got last time. Because they'll eventually be able to eat all this stuff, but perhaps it'll just take a little bit more time for the decomposition process to kick in and for the worms to be able to make use of all this food here. So the stuff will certainly remain in the system as leftovers, but I think that there is value in coming in with the food I was going to give them today. What I have for them today is also not frozen. It's a cucumber which shows signs of deterioration, still in its shrink wrap here. And this is the sort of thing that I think whether or not it's been frozen first or not, I think the worms are going to be able to make good use of it as a food item. And that'll tie them over until such a point in time, hopefully in the near future, when all these items will eventually start to break down and become available as food for the wormies in here. Here's some of the paper that had been serving the purpose of top covering that we used as bedding in the last feeding. And I think there's going to be another similarly sized piece in here if we keep excavating. There's also other signs of things that they received. Some orange peel. Like I said, none of the stuff that this system's been getting for a few feedings now has been frozen. Most likely resulting in that stuff taking a little bit longer to break down. So I think by giving them this cucumber, it'll be a good thing. Okay. All right, let's see if we can pick up the pace here a little bit. I'm sort of feeling like I'm gawking in a way, just checking every piece out, perhaps a little bit more thoroughly than is necessary. It is good to see, for example, right here in between the two leaves of cabbage. So you got some of this purple or red cabbage, whatever it's called, in between a leaf of the traditional green or white cabbage or whatever. I'm not sure what the exact names of these are. Actually, this is not a leaf of cabbage. This is the stem. So this is where the head of cabbage would be. And this is pretty interesting to see here, because all over this thing I could see little tiny roots. I could see roots trying to grow here and little shoots, what appear to be shoots, starting to grow on this side. So interestingly enough, this chunk of cabbage, presumably because it is the stem end, still has enough life left in it to try to continue growing here in the worm bin. So it'll also just go right back in for the wormies to continue making use of as best as they can gradually as the stuff deteriorates. And since there is a good bit of leftovers in here, I am starting to wonder whether coming back in here could be delayed a little bit. Here too we've got a carrot which appears to have attempted to start growing again. For me this is a little bit unusual because almost everything I freeze and putting stuff into the bin unfrozen this way does seem to result in somewhat different outcomes than I'm accustomed to. Whether it's just the slow breakdown due to it not having been frozen first, or the attempts of the stuff to continue growing down here in the bin. These are things that I don't very often see. Probably due to the fact that most stuff I feed has been first frozen. So I apologize if I'm drawing this out perhaps a little longer than it needs to be. Here's another stem of a head of cabbage. This is the red cabbage's stem end. And I guess once again I'm just indulging my curiosity to see if there's any signs of stuff growing. In a way, this here also appears to be little things shooting out, attempting to grow here down in the worm bin, just like the other stem end that we found of the white or green head of cabbage. So I have a funny feeling that those things are just going to continue on doing the same thing going forward. But I think we've excavated enough space here for today's feeding, since it's really just a cucumber. So why don't we proceed with just giving them that thing, and then we'll also take a quick glance around the system to see how things elsewhere look. I think I'm going to go back to what I've been doing here typically in previous feedings, which is to not include bedding. Because after we fed last time, which did include this little bit of recycled top covering newspaper as bedding, we tilled around the rest of the bin to see how things looked. And we did actually encounter a whole bunch of this stuff here, which is the shredded paper cardboard bedding that I built the system out of. And we did find little pockets of this stuff that appeared to have never even been disturbed by the worms. So I attempted to blend some of that stuff in with the rest of the surrounding materials. But I think by encountering all that, it told me that the system does still have adequate bedding material in it and doesn't require replenishment again. So I think we'll be okay simply sticking with what we've got as far as bedding goes. Although I do have one piece of bedding that I think we could utilize. Not a very big piece, but it's the feeding zone indicator from last time, because besides this cucumber we're dropping in, I also bought down a portion of coffee, which includes the filter, and that'll become the replacement feeding zone indicator for this system right here. That means we can at least include a little itsy bitsy tiny piece of supplementary bedding. It's not much, that's for sure, with today's feeding. So that's that, and we won't add any more. This right here will go on top as our feeding zone indicator, replacement feeding zone indicator. Before we return all the old foods that were placed in here last time, 12 days ago, let's finish applying the new stuff. The stuff I sprinkled in first was my pulverized eggshell, which is the grit that I use in my worm bins, and then this stuff here is my latest batch of worm chow. So I think that's going to be their feeding today. This thing, by the way, is the stem of Brussels sprouts. Pretty tough object, an object that or a food type at least, that I typically don't feed in my worm bins. Usually Brussels sprouts around here are purchased kind of individually rather than on a stem, still connected to the stem that they grow on. So this is sort of a novelty item here. And man, oh man, this feeding zone is jam-packed. I do like to cover up the feeding zones in my worm bins pretty thoroughly if I can, but I suppose if we're unable to do so here, it won't be the end of the world. We will be coming back on with the newspaper coverings, with the plastic top cover cardboard, plastic wrapped cardboard. But I believe if we till up the outer edges and we aerate the stuff, fluff it up a little bit in the process, we can probably come up with enough material here with which we can cover the entire top surface. You can see a whole bunch of this material that I just excavated is seemingly unutilized bedding material. Still just big piles of stuff that looks like it's got no signs of any worm traffic yet in it. That stuff I like to try to blend in with, you know, surrounding materials that have clearly been occupied by the worms, where there's castings beginning to pile up, just so that that stuff can finally start getting utilized as bedding and food by the wormies. So I think that that excavation off of this side of the bin did result in a whole bunch of nice stuff that we were able to fluff up and use to cover. And we've still got this side that we can do the same with, so let's do the same and bring it over and take a look at it and then spread it out. And with that, I think we'll have a pretty decent top covering of the feeding zone. And you know, a lot of people might be thinking, geez, you should really wait a while, you know, instead of coming back here every 12 days. And it does seem like 12 days has become the de facto interval around here, because I checked the past few feedings and, oh my goodness, hold on one second. Here we go. I gave this avocado pit a little squeeze and the thing shattered in half. But yeah, it does seem like 12 days somehow turned into the feeding interval for the past few feedings. And some people might be saying, you know, you could probably wait a little while longer based on what we saw here, all that abundance of leftovers. But I'm still inclined to come back in here, perhaps in another 10, 12, 14 days like we've been doing, to give them more stuff, because I think that cucumber will be gone, and maybe by then those cabbage leaves that we encountered from the last feeding will still be holding out and not displaying much progress. And if that were the case, then I would certainly feel like giving them some other stuff that they can actually get down into and consume would be a good idea, you know, rather than kind of forcing them to have stuff that they're just unable to take advantage of. You know, they'll be crawling all over the stuff, but if they can't really rip into it as a food source, then, you know, let's give them stuff that they can. And then eventually that stuff will get to the point where they can begin nibbling on it and working it down. But until that time, they can certainly be working on other stuff and breaking it down. So that's it for our check-in now with my newest 77-day-old bin. This was feeding number 7. And now we've got ourselves a nice new replacement feeding zone indicator. Back on can come the top covering newspaper, which was actually brand new a week ago, but still does not really show many signs of wear yet. And back on can come my fancy plastic coated piece of cardboard top covering. Alright everyone, that's it for our check-in. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated, and if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.